Hello, good evening. I'm Akanksha Rastogi, Senior Curator at the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us today for the fifth lecture, Creating Infrastructures, under the second set of our KNMA's Researchers Practice program. This second set is thematized under the rubric of crafting thought, wherein we have interacted so far with architects, textile historians, artists, and publishers, and now with Professor Lilly Irani, who is a science, technology, and society scholar and academic. And this crafting thought set is conceptualized by art historian and designer Annapurna Garimella, who will also be in conversation today after Professor Lilly Irani's lecture with her. And I mean, as some of you are already familiar with Professor Lilly Irani's work, but I'll still give a brief introduction to her very large practice. She's an Associate Professor of Communication and Science Studies at the University of California, San Diego. She also serves as faculty in Design Lab Institute for Practical Ethics, the program in Critical Gender Studies, and sits on the Academic Advisory Board of AI Now at NYU. She's the author of her she recently co-authored with Jess Marks a very, very amazing book titled Redacted, which we highly recommend for you to go out, purchase, and read. She's also the author of Chasing Innovation, Making Entrepreneurial Citizens in Modern India. Her research examines the cultural politics of high-tech work and the counter practices they generate. As both an ethnographer, a designer, and a former technology worker. And today she'll be also sharing some aspects of her early career as a technology worker, which she started out in, at Google, I guess. She'll share more about it. And she's also a co-founder of the digital worker advocacy organization, Turk Opticon. It's such a great pleasure to have you here, Professor Lilly Irani. Thank you so much for so generously accepting our invitation and joining us so early in the morning. It's 6 a.m. in San Diego, so we really appreciate this. So without further delay, I would like to hand it over to Annapurna Garimella to elaborately talk about what she's expecting and what she's planning to do with the subject, creating infrastructures, and also her own interest in Irani's work. Over to you, Annapurna.
Well, thank you for such a lovely introduction, Akanksha, and also thank you, Lilly, for waking up so early and being so game to take this on. And I contacted you several months ago, and you were really clear about when you could do it, and you turned up, and I really appreciate that. I guess I should probably begin a little bit in my own biography, as sometimes I've done, which is that I came into a work world at age 18 when the personal computer became a widely available technology in offices. I was working, my first job with the personal computer was at a custom cabinetry shop in Los Angeles. And then it was interesting to watch. I was good at coding, and it was interesting to watch how the business was gradually being understood when billing was easier, and all these kinds of things were happening. My second job was as a paralegal in a law office that worked on bankruptcy law, and I learned coding enough to understand that matching the changes in bankruptcy law, which allowed payments to be collected back from people who had been owed money and the company had paid them 3 months before it filed bankruptcy. That money was collected again and they were repaid. It was redistributed. It was called redistributed to all the debtors, all the people that were owed money. Debtees, all the people that were owed money, right? So I had learned enough coding to create a sort of very basic Excel style, rapid document generation format where it was a plug and play, basically, of addresses that you could just dump dump into this document. So instead of generating one document at a time for court filing, you could generate like 200 at a time. I had no idea the consequences. I was 19, 20 years old at the time. And the company that, this was Los Angeles, and this was the era when gold bullion was very valuable. Gold had, somewhat like now, people didn't have much faith in the economy, so they were buying bullion, gold bars essentially, and investing their entire lifetime savings in a company that went bankrupt. It was essentially a pyramid scheme. And some of the people that these filings, these court filings went to, actually called our office and would cry on the phone saying, this is my entire life savings. And one person even committed suicide, including another person, including the owner of this company. So I think that everybody has a wake-up moment where you understand that your enthusiasm and your capacity to do is in direct friction with the world that is flowing around you and in which you live in. So since then, I trained as a designer, and then as an art historian, and I still practice design to some extent, not in any retail kind of way. I've been thinking, meanwhile, I've been active in the art world too, in different capacities. And I've been thinking a lot about how we're designing the art world. Let me start there. How we design the art world, because I think it is, we have, if we think of designing the art world, then I think we give ourselves some agency and some creativity and some capacity to reflect on how we are shaping something that we all live in. So in that process, I came to understand that collaboration, words like collaboration, alternatives, solidarities, all these words which sound so good and sounded so good in the 2000s and the late 1990s, were perhaps much more complex and nuanced. I needed to have obviously much more complex and nuanced ideas about them. So another word that I kept coming up across because of working in the sector of craft, especially over the last 10, 12 years, is this pressure of innovation and what innovation means. So, and who's supposed to become an innovator and who's already an innovator, teaching people how to innovate. All these questions were there. In that process, I co-authored an essay with the art historian Santosh Sakinala, and I deeply engaged with Lilly's work, Chasing Innovation. So her work on hackathons, her work on microwork. I haven't yet read her work on post-colonial computing, but I really want to address that. And her work on design education, design cultures, ideas of innovation, are really meaningful to me. And I'm putting this in this series because she's a practitioner as much as she's an academic, and academics is a kind of practice too. It's not like academics is not a practice, but there's two different kinds of practice dovetailing each other, rubbing up against each other sometimes, I think, and sometimes helping her evolve both. So I invite Lilly to start the conversation, as we have been doing for the last 4 lectures. This is the 5th lecture. She will speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'll ask her a few questions. And I really invite all of you to join us after that and put your own questions in the chat box if you don't want to raise your hand, but I would really appreciate it if you raise your hand and put forward your question. And I'm happy to read them out too if you like. So this is our conversation, and I'm looking forward to whatever Lilly has to say. Thank you, Lilly.
Yes, thank you so much for all of you who've come out tonight, and to the team at Kiran, Nadar, and Annapurna and Akansha for creating this series, staging these conversations. I will say when as the academic part of me gets a lot of invitations to give talks, but our talks are often of a genre of, coming to the table ready to convince people of a particular argument that I've already been working on for a really long time. But here I will be sharing work that I've been doing for a long time, but Annapurna's creative grappling with the complexities of the world in which we're trying to understand how we live together and how the material world shapes how we live together has really creatively helped me understand a lot of the questions that she's raising that I'll be talking about today in a new way. So this has already been an event that in the making of it, I'm changed through it, and I'm really looking forward to how the conversation among us also changes us collectively. So I'm going to be sharing with you some key moments in my practice as a designer, my practice as a person who sees situations in the world and gets angry about them and wants to do something about them, and my practice as an academic and the ways that they informed each other around questions that I now recognize share a common thread around the questions of crafting infrastructure. Much of my work has been preoccupied with technology, whether and how we should care about technology, and especially who gets to evolve who gets to direct the evolving forms that technology takes. We're often told that, or at least I was taught that the way you get to direct the forms technology takes is to be a designer, to be an engineer, to in some ways master the mechanisms and flows of how it works. But the problem of crafting infrastructure is actually much more collective than what any designer or technologist can deal with in the ways that I hope that we will see. Okay, so the first moment of crafting infrastructure I wanted to talk about is a moment in which it became very clear to me that infrastructure was a site of power and a site of agency, but a problematic agency for designers and technologists as individuals or small groups. So I studied computer science at Stanford back in the mid 2000s. And this residential university, students stay up all night, working on their projects, talking to one another, helping each other on their projects. And we kind of created this cultural world of technology students having discussions about how to direct our labor in the future and how to direct our lives in the future. And a pervasive idea that would come up among us was this idea that these tech companies, at the time Microsoft was the big technology player, was where there was really enough infrastructure to make it impact. So if your job as a technologist is in some ways to influence how the world works with technology, then going to a company like Microsoft was the place to be. They were the ones who had the reach, had the ability to implement software systems that would in some ways make a difference. Now, 20 years later, I might recognize, and perhaps you might recognize this, actually as something of a colonial epistemology and a fantasy, that to make a difference is to be close to a network that can introduce changes across a wide social and territorial space. But the education that we received in computer science left us completely unprepared to kind of recognize the historical parallels here. And instead, we kind of lived among others who shared an ideology that it is in fact a good to have groups of technologists able to make a difference across a network in other people's lives in this way. Now, in 2022, this analysis of technology and kind of control over networks of data as somehow colonial has, thank goodness, become somewhat more commonplace. Even Mukesh Ambani recognizes this when he writes about the problem of data sovereignty. There's an article that I saw that he had written about the problem of data sovereignty being one of the problem of companies like Facebook and Google controlling so much of the data that is used by Indians, created by Indians. And he sought with the article with others to direct attention to how India ought to control its data. Although when we talk about the topic of data sovereignty, and I'd be happy to talk about this more in our conversation, we should recognize that there are many different trajectories by which we might resist a kind of data imperialism of Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Netflix. And some of those trajectories to resist data sovereignty still center the ownership over data of the very powerful and are still oppressive in their own right in the same ways that Google and Microsoft's ability to control data networks is imperial. But going back to 2003 and this kind of computer science student desire to make a difference, maybe in which I was very similar to Annapurna, kind of unprepared to recognize the implication of these extended automated practices, I did go to work for Google. This was in its early days when it was a smaller company, 2003 through 2007. It was a moment when I started when there were 700 people there, not the, I don't even know how many people they have there, to be honest. I think when I left Google, it was 60,000 people. But this was a moment when Stanford graduate students were transforming into global industrial tycoons and maybe didn't even know it themselves. This is where I first saw firsthand Google's efforts to expand the reach of its infrastructures as it worked to hire designers in India and China to build offices in what they would call emerging markets within the office. And their goal is to get more people to use Google's products in those places, seeing those places as a place to extend its influence, although at the time we thought of it as extending our usefulness. So here, working as a designer, my job was to study people as potential users of Google's products and to understand what needs and desires among these people might be profitable for Google to address as it sought to embed itself as a prize tool. So this, being a designer in this scenario, we thought of ourselves as really working to make technology good for people. And I'm casting it now in a more, in a darker tone of being a tool for market expansion, but I'm happy to talk about that more in discussion. But I'll share with you one moment, I think, that was, I think as Annapurna called it, a kind of wake up moment in understanding the darker side of what my design practice was about in this situation at Google. So there's a team of designers working at Google that I knew well, and they had a project to go look at technology use in India. And so they actually hired a design firm here in Delhi. The design firm is called Quicksand. There's fabulous people in that firm. So Google designers hired Quicksand designers to go out and study how people in Indian cities find out about restaurants through their friends and family. The problem for Google's design team was to figure out how people find out about restaurants and then figure out how they could make the technology tools that Google builds more useful for that information finding tasks. So in a way, what Google is trying to do is figure out how to displace the ways that people do find restaurants through friends, through family members, through coworkers, through neighbors, and figure out how to bring that relationship by which people make meaning about public space, make meaning about food, how they tell stories about food, displace that by bringing that interaction into an app and making Google the intermediary for that kind of meaning making and storytelling. So this was a moment when I came to understand that making Google useful as a technology infrastructure was actually to try to introduce a practice in which a company that controls an information infrastructure makes itself into a powerful intermediary of meaning making, and that company may convince itself it's doing it to make the world a better place, but of course it's doing it for profit and then changing, becoming a key gatekeeper and controller and designer of those practices. So when we talk about designing tools or designing objects, which is what I was trained to think about I was trained to think about a person, their practices, the meanings they make of those practices, and that in some sense that people have some kind of choice about what objects they surround themselves with and how they use those objects. But thinking about Google as a tool was insufficient. One can pick up a tool or put it down. Rather, Google wanted to make itself a part of the kind of consistent digital pathway of people's everyday lives. And it wanted to make itself into an everyday infrastructure that people rely on, take for granted, and that can mediate how people relate for each other. And this is what in the company we would call and celebrate an innovation. So with this wake-up call, I came across a concept several years later that seemed more adequate than tool or object to describe the kind of system that we were dealing with at Google, and the kinds of both responsibility and the kinds of gravity of and expansiveness of the intervention that we were making. And that concept is this concept of infrastructure. Excuse me for a moment. Often when we think of infrastructure, we might think of roads, planes, the Delhi metro. And sometimes we might think of, computing infrastructure, the capacity to process data. There's a kind of commonplace definition of infrastructure. If you look at the dictionary definition, is the installations that form the basis for any operation or system. There's a theory of infrastructure that comes from sociologists and historians who are trying to understand the histories of technologies as they shaped entire organizations. And this was Susan Lee Starr, Karen Ruleter, Jeff Bowker. And they conceptualized infrastructures as those systems that extend across time and space, those systems that undergird the practices of many different communities, and those systems that enable and constrain the practices of these many different communities. And so the practices of communities actually evolve with the infrastructure. They were trying to understand computerization in the 1990s. This moment when computers were new, and they were realizing that the computer systems that were being introduced into organizations, say a medical care setting, would affect the practices of the nurses, the doctors, the people doing payments processing in completely different ways. And yet there was the same infrastructure that all those different worlds had their practices linked through. The nurses and the doctors might have interacted with each other before over medical records that they would share on paper and through their communication over a patient, but the computer system made those practices then more available to the people in the administration who also do payments processing. So the infrastructure actually brought new people and practices into connection with the doctors and nurses, and then made new processes of payments management and of the management of medical care possible because these practices had been informationalized and then connected. So this is the significance of infrastructure. It changed how people related to one another, and it made it possible for those who design the infrastructures to also change the many communities of practice in turn. So with this in mind as a moment that helps us understand the kind of gravity and the kind of expansiveness of who is affected by infrastructure, I want to talk about a second moment, a second wake-up call for me, in which I started to understand actually a domain that I had only thought about informally, the domain of labor, and how people's labor got made into a technological infrastructure. So this moment was, as I was leaving Google and entering graduate school, I was kind of surrounded in Silicon Valley by people who were designing new algorithms. So at Google was constantly trying to design and redesign its search algorithm, and they would make some changes to how they ranked pages, and they needed to figure out, did this algorithm, the new one that we're considering, work better about the same or worse than the algorithm they were replacing. And so internally, they had a system in which they could just basically show the results of the new algorithm for a particular search. Say search for boats. Here's the results of the old algorithm. Here's the results of the new algorithm. And they had a system that would then show hundreds of people, workers, the old and the new, and then they would have those workers say, make a judgment about whether the old one or the new one was better for certain results. So, they were trying to automate, they were trying to create artificial intelligence, but the real judge of whether an artificial intelligence is good is actually the people who have that cultural intelligence already. And so they had to hire people to do this task. And there were lots of tasks actually like this all around Silicon Valley. And I had friends at other search companies who would use a platform that Amazon had actually created that would make it very easy for them to access workers all over the world, but primarily in India and the United States, to do these kinds of tasks. So what Amazon Mechanical Turk was a way, like a gig work platform, the way we might think of, Uber or Ola, where there's an app and the app makes other people as workers quickly and conveniently available for the person who needs it. But this was an app that was meant for these artificial intelligence engineers. It was a way of organizing how those artificial intelligence engineers interacted with workers working from their homes. It was an app where employers could put large piles of data processing tasks that they had onto a platform. And then workers who were working from their homes could come to the Amazon website and look at lists and lists and lists of employers, look at the tasks that were there, look at how much the pay was per task. And they could decide, do I want to do this task or not, based on very little information about the employer, actually, which would end up becoming a problem. But because there are tens of thousands of workers sitting at the ready to do these data processing tasks for employers could get their data processing tasks done very quickly. And so the kinds of tasks that employers would put there were not only judging algorithms, often it was putting, say, piles of images and asking workers to classify those images. So if you want to, many of us have had the experience of trying to log into a website and then being asked if we were human, essentially, like, please check off all the images that have a stop sign in it. Please check off all the images that have a car in it. Those are classification tasks. We're being asked to classify images as having a certain object of interest in it or not in it. Amazon Mechanical Turk workers get paid to do that kind of work over and over and over, and to create the classified data sets, then train algorithms to make that same classification. In some ways, when we do that kind of task, when we're trying to log in, we are also unpaid Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. Amazon Mechanical Turk workers get paid to transcribe audio files into textual language so that artificial intelligence can learn to speak different languages. They might get used to classify, these workers might be the ones who are helping classify whether a piece of text is offensive, is pornographic, so that companies like Facebook that have lots of content to moderate can quickly classify that. So these workers are in charge of processing what I call cultural data, the kinds of data that artificial intelligence will never be able to actually process, but that engineers want to create experiences of technological magic around. They want to automate it for the time being. And so they need to rapidly hire 10,000 workers to come help them classify these tasks, to build another algorithm to test whether their new technology is working well. And if it's not working well, then try again, and then test it again with another batch of 10,000 workers. So it makes it incredibly easy to to hire and fire 10,000 workers in a day, instead of having to sign a contract with an outsourcing firm or have a pool of people inside your company that do this kind of work. So this platform for workers is actually a way of organizing the interactions between these employers and workers. Amazon's platform, it actually introduces a style of how these employers can relate to workers. And it has become an infrastructure, very much something that engineers rely on in their day-to-day, very much something that different kinds of engineers rely on in their day-to-day, that makes new kinds of practices possible. So how is it that Amazon enables employers and workers to interact? Well, it allows employers and workers to quickly access workers, but it also gives these employers many privileges in how they interact with workers. So Amazon tells employers that if you put your work on the platform and you don't like the result a worker gives you, you don't have to pay for the work at all. This is meant to inspire in employers the confidence that they can use this platform and only pay for the work that they find to be of a certain quality. But what it actually enables for as an experience for workers is the experience of wage theft. So an employer can come along and have workers do the work. They can receive the work, and then they can decide, I'm just not going to pay for it. And Amazon doesn't mediate that process in any way. It's completely left to the arbitrary judgment of the employer. Sometimes when workers get rejected, it might be because they've actually done bad faith, bad work. But sometimes when they get rejected, it's because the employer has actually designed the task badly, has designed the work or explained the work in a confusing way, but they never meet the worker. They never have a chance to actually explain to explain the task or get clarifying questions from the workers. So they may never even realize that their task is designed poorly. And so when they get a bad result, it's that because they've never met this worker, they've simply put the work onto a website. It is easy for them to just assume that the work was done in bad faith, that the worker is of poor quality, and the worker should not get paid. And of course, there's the problem of employers who come along and they don't have that much money and they don't want to pay for the task. So when the employer does not pay for the task, there's another way that this infrastructure is designed to allow for the placing of all the blame on workers and for the making of workers, even good faith workers, as disposable. And so that mechanism is that when an employee, apologies, it's the morning and I have not had coffee yet. When the employer rejects the work that workers do, Amazon takes that as a signal that the work has been done in bad faith or of bad quality. And so Amazon actually has a rating for workers called the approval rating. The approval rating is the percentage of tasks that the worker has done that have been approved by the employer. And the act of approving is simply the act of paying for. So when you have an employer who rejects a bunch of tasks so as to not pay, the worker's approval rating goes down, and the worker actually may lose access to many kinds of work on the platform, because when an employer puts work on the platform, they have the ability to specify, I will only allow this task to be done by workers who have had 99% of their tasks approved, 98% of their tasks approved. These ratings are very high. So for a worker who ends up in this trap of getting rejected or having a lot of the tasks that they do rejected by an employer who doesn't know what they're doing on their platform or is acting in bad faith, their approval rating takes a hit and they may actually lose access to their livelihood. So we could see here that Amazon as a company, it has a power to design an infrastructure that shapes how employers and workers relate to each other. And Amazon actually designed this platform internally for its own use at first. And we might think of this as a very old problem of employee-worker relations. And of course, these relations have been fraught for centuries. But what Amazon can do is actually create its employee-worker relations, the tools that it designed internally to help process the data that it had for its own internal operations. It actually created a platform, a designed system that it actually made available publicly. for many other companies all around the world, for employers all around the world. And in some sense, like Amazon's culture of how it treats workers is now embedded in this infrastructural system, and now can be used by many others in ways that orchestrate the relationships that Amazon imagines for employees and workers, and makes it available for many others to use. So we have here an infrastructure that moves across time and space and shapes the practices of many. I want us to also see this kind of the pattern of infrastructure that Amazon has orchestrated here as also supporting a certain kind of cultural pattern. So I've already talked about the culture of disposability of workers that this platform makes possible. But in my research on trying to understand how and why workplaces privilege certain kinds of people as innovative, as creating lots of value for companies, as the kinds of workers, the engineers who should be empowered to experiment rapidly to develop new lines of profit for companies, I also found that Amazon Mechanical Turk's infrastructure was an infrastructure for the cultural division between innovators and innovators others. Innovators and those people who are necessary absolutely for innovators to be able to work, but are less valued in many of the kinds of innovation economy projects that we find ourselves living among. So for those innovative workers, the engineers, the AI experimenters, the designers who are creating prototypes rapidly through the Amazon platform, rather than hiring people in the office to care for, clean, and prepare the data, people that they would have to actually encounter, people they might have to create knowledge collaboratively with, the platform allows it to be outsourced to people that are never met, far away. In the process, it allows for those creative innovators to claim the kind of the wonder and the credit we attribute to their innovation, all for themselves, while a certain segment of workers become invisible and disposable. So through this platform, innovation, which I've argued in some ways is already an exclusionary project by privileging designers and innovators over the kinds of maintainers that are always necessary for an innovation to become meaningful. Innovation through this platform becomes an even more exclusionary project, rendering invisible AI's essential workers, and then also locking those workers out of the workplaces in which these technological features are getting made. So, in this so I want to then now transition to talking about a third moment, a moment in which I and my friend Six Silberman and some Turk workers came to respond to this infrastructure that Amazon had created with a system. And the system is called Turk Opticon, and it's a system that's meant to get workers a modicum of power in the situation in which they are atomized, in which they have to choose among so many workers who can treat them as disposable, enabled by the platform, in which they can form some kinds of solidarities with one another by sharing information that can help them find the better employers and find ways to improve their working conditions. So a lot of my I would say academic and design practice come from a certain impulse I have to get frustrated or angry with situations that I think are unjust, and then try to figure out what it is that I might be able to do about it. And so this moment of coming through Silicon Valley and seeing this platform, Amazon Mechanical Turk, as an infrastructure popularizing, was a moment that was another kind of wake-up call moment for me. So I was coming out of Google. I was seeing that Google was using certain kinds of workers in this way. I was seeing a lot of friends coming out of the computer science department at Stanford who were starting companies, who were talking about Amazon Mechanical Turk as a system that it's like technological magic, they would say. It allows them to just get access to people so quickly. It's just so amazing. I can build stuff so quickly. And I was kind of shocked by how uninterested so many of my friends were with the conditions in which people were working. The platform allowed them to imagine that people are coming to work as a choice, and however much they get paid, even if they're not making anything close to minimum wage, even if they're making, $6 an hour or $2 an hour, something that would never be enough to live on in Silicon Valley, because the platform isolated workers from them. They thought, well, workers are choosing to work for this, and so for whatever reason, that must be, worthwhile for their situation. I was incredibly frustrated by this, and so I began a project when I entered graduate school at UC Irvine, encouraged by an art class that was asking us to ask questions about media and how we might tactically intervene into it. I began asking questions about Amazon Mechanical Turk as a platform, what workers liked about it, and what workers didn't like about it. As a feminist, I didn't think it was my place to prejudge what workers should and should not like about it. But as a feminist, I felt like it was my duty to be curious about other people's working conditions and to figure out how I could form solidarities with other people's efforts to work in better conditions. There's a strange link to feminism there for me, actually. I think a lot of what I learned about work was from my parents' relationship and my mother working in the home, taking care of us as kids, sometimes doing childcare work paid in the home. And I understood that at the same moment that my mom does work in the home, that is often devalued because it's unpaid, is thought of as just staying at home, thought of as not that difficult. I was being encouraged to become a computer scientist and to really make something of myself. And in some ways, that overvaluing a computer scientist is part of the devaluing of the work that is actually the work that helps people survive and grow and become acculturated, which is this work of reproduction, of taking care of people. And so that early experience of kind of questioning why some work was really valued and some work and some people were devalued is the kind of experience that brought me to Mechanical Turk as a feminist, but in a way that I think people wouldn't really guess, because Mechanical Turk is not childcare work. But my friend Six and I, we put out a survey to 100 workers, and we asked, what would you like about this work? What do you not like about this work? And if you could have a Bill of Rights, in this platform, what would you want that Bill of Rights to say? And so we found that there were many workers had really diverse answers about why they were on the platform. Some were there because this is a way they could make money when their other job didn't give them enough hours to make money. For some, it allowed them to stay home and take care of their kids and be able to go see their kids' soccer games or go to activities because they could choose when they come in and out of the work. For some, they had disabilities, and so arguing with an employer about the ways to make their workplace accessible was too difficult. And so this let them work at home under conditions they felt in some ways they controlled more. And they disagreed a lot over what they want their Bill of Rights to be. So at the time, people thought some people wanted minimum wage implemented, but others didn't want minimum wage. They didn't want more kind of policy supervision. But one thing that they agreed on a lot was this problem I've told you about of workers getting their work arbitrarily rejected. That was something that 70% of the people we talked to mentioned in some way. And so Six and I built, we saw that there's no way in the platform for workers to see which employers are likely to reject large swaths of workers' work. And so they're always making this choice in some ways with a blindfold put on. Workers did have already an ecology of web-based forums that they would talk to each other, they would teach each other, they would share information, they would debate, what are appropriate responses to certain things that happen in their workplace. But these web-based forums did not make it very convenient when you're evaluating 1,000 employers on this web site that you show up at your workplace. It didn't make it convenient to figure out which of these 1,000 people are going to reject me today. So Six and I built a tool called Turk Opticon that made it convenient for workers. So it allowed workers to put reports for an employer that we would then store on our website, and we build something called a browser extension. So workers could put this into their web browser as they were browsing employers. And then as they were browsing, this little tool would look into our database, say, this employer we are looking at, do we have any information on them? And we would pull whatever reports other workers had created about that employer and put it right into the Amazon website. We would insert it into the workplace. So this tool over the years became something of an infrastructure for workers itself. At a peak, we had 20,000 workers actively using it every month. The tools still exist today, but as Six and I built this tool. In some ways, we built this tool in like a week. We sat down during one winter in January. We coded it. We showed it to some engineer friends. Those engineer friends actually put the tool on Amazon Mechanical Turk, when they were using it, and told workers about it. And then workers started talking about it, and more were using it. And so we found ourselves over 10 years having taken this design project, and it had become a critical infrastructure. And frankly, we were totally ill prepared in our training to understand the ramifications of what we had committed to. We were committed to workers that had put their faith in this tool and had put their faith in us. We had come to see that workers, anxieties about how they enter the workplace and choose employers was greatly shaped by whether they had access to this tool or not. But in design training, in engineering training, we had learned how to think about and craft a tool, its properties, the way the tool communicates, how to put that tool in front of people and have them test the prototype and iterate and transform the tool to make it fit with people's practices. But we had not prepared to create an organization that can maintain a tool, that can maintain the code, that can repair the code, that can keep in touch with the people who are using the tool, that can mediate conflicts between people using the tool, different directions people want the tool to go, that can keep people connected to the project in a way that they will volunteer their time. All of the ways that infrastructures get maintained were excluded from our design education. And in fact, just the tacit background of our education was that you will one day go work for a company, and that company will maintain and manage the things that you design and build because they will have enough money to pay people or to convince people to do it without pay somehow, as is the case with open source technologies. So over the years, we faced challenges of, people burning out. I would get burned out. Six, my collaborator who, co-founded this project, got burned out. There were workers who day to day were community managers, talking to Turk workers, figuring out which direction the tools needs to go, finding me and Six not having the right kinds of time, the right amount of time to be responsive because we were doing this as a volunteer task alongside our other jobs. They got burned out too. And 10 years later, Six and I put out a call to workers saying, hey, we would like to turn this project over to workers. We would like workers to govern it and to direct it. We pledged to try to figure out how to find the resources to actually do the maintenance. Please come to us with proposals. Please come to us as a group. We put that call out. We waited for 2 months, putting the call out. Nobody came to us. Workers talked about this problem. They debated with each other how they should respond. Sometimes they got into arguments about it online, but no cohesive group came forward. And I see that actually as a problem of the ways that the internet organizes communication and collaboration, where it's really easy to put your thoughts on the internet, but it's really hard to talk to people, to build an emotional connection with people, to sit for a couple of hours and really hear where somebody is coming from and try to kind of hear their proposals and make counter proposals. It's hard to develop commitments with each other. On the internet, it's easy to have ephemeral communications. So no group was able to come forward and build the kind of cohesiveness as a group that they could trust each other to say volunteer to take this over. So I found a grant from the Open Societies Foundation, and that grant was earmarked to hold workshops, at the time, to hire an organizer who would go and talk to lots of workers and figure out how they could be organized, to figure out whether there was an appetite to maintain Turk Opticon, and then figure out how to organize people to maintain Turk Opticon, but also to try to, then the hope was to have those workers organized to improve working conditions more broadly. And then through the workshops that we held, we met 40 workers who came out to talk about what the future of Turk Opticon should be. At that workshop, Six and I emphasized that one of the things that had happened over the decade was that Turk Opticon, this tool, this infrastructure, it had also become a sort of band-aid for Amazon to outsource its problems to. One of the things that had happened was that when workers would go to Amazon and say they had problems with a certain employer, Amazon would say, please go talk about this on one of the community-run solutions that are out there. So they would direct workers to Turk Opticon, they would direct workers to the worker-operated forums. And so in some sense, they had outsourced their human resources tasks, outsourced the problems that their platform had designed and created for how it lets employers treat workers as imposable. They'd outsourced it to the community. It had outsourced it to all of us who are running these systems without any kind of material support and unpaid. And so in these workshops, one of the things we talked about with workers was that, if you're going to come and help operate and govern this platform and direct its future, you should understand that in some ways this platform performs free labor for Amazon. And we collectively agreed that the project needed to address what we could think of as the upstream sources of harm, the design and policy problems in the platform that need to change, rather than only dealing with them at the moment that the harm had been created, and then now the worker was harmed and there to report about it in the platform. So that was 2 years ago, and today, a committee, they started with 3 workers who said, okay, out of these 43 stuck around and said, okay, we want to figure out how we can do this project. Over those 2 years, we took trainings together, learning community organizing strategies. We had so many conversations about how we can improve the Turk Opticon platform. We taught some of those workers coding in small ways so they can manipulate the platform themselves. And today, now there's a committee of 8 people who meet every Wednesday to direct the futures of this project. That committee has tackled the task of creating a petition that they delivered to Amazon, suggesting a concrete proposal for how Amazon should handle rejections differently. They did this by actually spending the time to talk to workers in different worker forums and coming up with a coalition that would stand behind the solution that they're proposing to Amazon. So they've had a meeting with Amazon, but we're still waiting for Amazon to actually implement something. So there may need to be an escalation of what the pressure that the workers put on Amazon. And so Turk Opticon has become not just an infrastructural band-aid for sharing reviews, but also a collective project that then through that brings workers together to also collectively organize around other projects that relate to why Amazon is necessary. So I think for me, this journey through these 10 years of Turk Opticon of of building a tool that became a critical infrastructure, of kind of grappling with how utterly unprepared I was in the design and engineering training that teaches nothing of more strategies of community organizing, of creating sustainable organizations. It's been a journey of learning that many of the problems that we have with technology are not at all a problem of design or innovation or even technology ethics, but rather ones of organizing and sustaining organizations in which people can develop collectively an idea of what they think needs to change with technology, say how Amazon's platform needs to change, and going through the work of taking each other seriously in collaboration to work through conflict, to be in solidarity, to, like the Turk workers, to be able to come up with the solutions to propose and to come up with organizing and activist strategies to bring those technological features about. Another lesson has been that, you know, solidarities between technology workers who are more elite, or treated as more elite, the designers and the engineers, and so, you know, the solidarities between them and the workers who are often kept far away from them, who are often paid so much less than the Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, are possible. So a lot of the analysis I had initially was that, you know, you have one class of workers that actually benefits from the exploitation of this other class of workers, and the Amazon platform makes that possible. But through the organizing the Turk Opticon project, even if that might be true in a broad structural sense, a group of middle-class programmers from a group called Tech Workers Coalition have come on to the Turk Opticon project and work with the Amazon workers and take their direction and do a lot of the system administration and maintenance, these things that can take a decade to learn as a craft. And so, you know, Turk Opticon has become a site of solidarity between workers in different parts of the technology sector's working classes. And that, you know, finding the possibility of those solidarities is also something that design engineering innovation training teaches you nothing of, but I think might be key to evolving infrastructures that actually befit the societies that we want to live in, that we aspire to live in, rather than the societies that Facebook and Amazon want us to live in. So my work today, beyond, what I've shared with you today has been really focused on Amazon Mechanical Turk and its role in Silicon Valley and its role in kind of constructing labor's futures. I think I shared this with you because this would be one thread that we could follow together over a decade. But my work today is expanded to other kinds of efforts as well to envision and implement more just and equitable infrastructural futures. So in San Diego, the city installed a smart city system that has a network of 4,000 surveillance cameras, microphones, and the possibility of being upgraded with all kinds of apps that the city did not consult, really didn't consult with most communities in the city at all about how this could affect them or what kind of system they would want to have in place for public safety. And so over the last 2 years, I've been involved in a coalition of 30 community groups to write a surveillance ordinance that gives, basically forces democratic elected officials oversight over these surveillance technologies. So I'm happy to talk about that more in our discussions. I've also been working with a taxi workers union here in San Diego to envision a role, to help them kind of envision and champion their role in becoming a sustainable solution to extending the train and trolley network as a first and last mile solution, rather than allowing simply Uber and Lyft to kind of dictate how transportation in the city works. So that's been the work of helping taxi workers get a digital app, figure out how that app can be funded, figuring out what kind of solidarities we can get from app developers, and then championing to our city council, to our county government, that they need to do more than let Silicon Valley innovate their way into how we move around as a city, and that they can, with this taxi workers vision of first last mile, keep money in the community, allow organizations that are governed by their own workers to provide that service instead, and to regulate those services so that they do keep cars off the road rather than incentivizing keeping cars on the road as much as possible for profit. So I want us to recognize infrastructures as systems that enable and constrain whole ways of life across many communities. And I want us to see the task of crafting infrastructures as something that I think that we need to learn how to do collectively without simply leaving it to a government to figure out, and then a government to then outsource through public-private partnerships to companies to figure out. and without, and resisting the impulse to let the convenience of a company that provides a service that becomes our infrastructure that governs our relationships. You're refusing the convenience of simply letting them do that and then silently reshape our lives. These infrastructures affect how we move, how we work, and how we relate to each other. And they're too important to be left to the experimental innovations of, say, a billion entrepreneurs, 1,000 public-private partnerships, or a few corporations. They have to be included as part of our democratic processes, and they're too important to leave to a move fast, break things, and apologize later approach characteristic of how Facebook, say, works. So rather than allowing infrastructures to happen to us, I want us to craft infrastructures by taking the time to develop them with an understanding of the social and material relations they sustain and encourage in the world. The process of crafting infrastructures is a long-term engagement. It involves commitments, labor, and knowledge of many people, and the stakes are high for all of us. So thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. What a delightful presentation. It's so nicely woven together, really big complex issues, and through everyday examples. So I have a couple of questions, and I'm waiting. So anybody who has questions, please raise your hand so that I can, I've got, one second, let me just put myself in a gallery view. Yeah, so anybody with questions, please raise. So Lilly, I want to just bring you back a little bit to chasing innovation and about, I know there are questions coming up on the horizon about your, how you thought about innovation and how you're thinking about innovation developed with the ethnographic work that you did in India. And talk a little bit about that. What I love about your book is because you use the tools of a historian and a anthropologist to really teach yourself some really big questions. So
oh my gosh.
Answer that, and then we'll ask Abhishek to raise his question after this.
I love the way you put that, to teach yourself some really big questions. That's absolutely right. So yeah, so this Amazon Mechanical Turk work that I've been talking about, I started that in 2009. I left Google in 2007, and then one of the other issues that I saw when I was at Google, and I kind of referenced this in the beginning of my talk, was that Google was expanding to into India and China, and it was trying to hire designers in those countries, and I encountered I encountered all kinds of ideas that designers in Silicon Valley had about who can innovate and what an innovator looks like. So somebody who's an innovator, someone who should be charged with designing the future technologies that we all use, is somebody who definitely uses an iPhone, definitely follows Swiss typography, definitely has a certain way of talking about and keeping up with subcultures of technologies that are really based on what a few American corporations are doing. And so at the same time, Google was getting its butt kicked. Sorry for this, kind of, I don't know how else to say it. They would try to design products for India, and like people wouldn't use them. And the products that were successful were ones that the designers didn't really understand. So I was interested in that kind of the chauvinism of designers who believe that they know where the future of technology comes from and what kind of people produce it. And I became interested in designers in India and what it is that they know about the cultures that they're designing for. Like, that's where the project started. And as I met a design firm in India, and I met some people from a design firm in India, and they were also frustrated about the ways that their clients in global north countries talk to them, treat them, attribute credit to them, and so they invited me to come and start working with them and studying the design projects that they work on. What became clear to me on starting to study the work of that design firm was that some of the the hierarchy between kind of global North designers and the designers that they were interacting with in places like Delhi, you know, that hierarchy also kind of imposed itself in the ways that designers work more generally and how they treat users as well. And so, you know, so designers see themselves as people who understand, you know, the way systems work, and how different kinds of knowledge about systems, about people, and about culture ought to be synthesized to come up with this designed future to be worked towards. But the people who would actually be living with these technologies, the users that they go out and they do their own anthropology with, whose practices they study, in some ways they don't have a political voice. They have a voice to give, you know, input to show themselves as cultural, as practitioners of cultures that designers need to understand, but they don't actually have a voice in the way the technology projects go. And in fact, designers don't have as much of a voice as we think we do in how the technology projects go either. Our clients do, the companies that hire us do. You know, they hire us companies hire designers to figure out like how to navigate the difference between what people are doing and what the company wants the people to do. I know that for me and for the designers that I studied in India, we have, many of us had, well, some of us at least, had different aspirations for why we became designers, to try to bring, to open up and democratize kind of technology processes. And so I think the process for me of writing Chasing Innovation was to learn the ways that design training has historically been about training designers to be mediators for institutions and companies with power, and then identifying the limitations to design practice that make it difficult for us to identify the ways that we become helpless to really open up technology and design questions to contestation and to act in solidarity with the people who actually want to see different technological users but are not in powerful design positions or positions with the company. So Chasing Innovation in some ways documents the problems of doing kind of human-centered design, ethnographic-driven design practices, of limiting our workshops to giving people input. And for me was a way of trying to then chart out, okay, like what do we need to do instead? And so there's a theme in the book about also the history of how and when design has been taken up to kind of, how do I say, to mediate thorny political questions about how the futures of technology, or even how the futures of the material cultures of a nation ought to be sorted out. So the history of NID was, Nehru bringing the Ford Foundation to India and bringing Ray and Charles Eames to India. But I think many designers in India know this history and are taught this history. But when I was reading this kind of Ford Foundation, they had written a history of themselves. And I was reading this book, and there was this line in there that Nehru was concerned about the kind of idle hands in the countryside and what kinds of rebellion those idle hands might foment. And so part of building a kind of economy of craft to be guided by designers who find use for craft in domestic and international markets was about quelling potential rebellions against the national project by finding a place for those people in it. Nehru, as part of the bigger state-making project, as political scientists have written about the ways that institutions like IIT and NID and in this IIM were meant to create cadre of experts that, along with bureaucrats in IAS, were meant to be able to do the work of planning away from the messy squabbles of politics. And so that's why there was for so long a planning commission that had its own budget and ability to implement projects away from electoral politics, because there's a kind of a mistrust of what the masses of the needy nation, as Nehru called it, would want. So design was one of the ways, bureaucrats were one of the ways that the kinds of desires of a needy nation and a desire to navigate towards a modernity that was both Indian and progressive, would be mediated in these kind of powerful, kind of technocratic figures that had to think about culture and people. And so that is, that vision of design, I think in a way is like perfectly, that's what Facebook and Google in some ways want designers to do as well. And so I'm calling for, and I'm trying to develop a design practice where, designers, we can take our understanding of systems and materials and bring that into solidarity with communities that we're part of, and with communities that we can become part of, that we can build an actual meaningful and accountable solidarity with, that might also have the political skills along with our design skills to then push for different design, push for different design features that companies or nation states might want us to have.
Thank you so much for a fulsome response. And then there's Abhishek Hazra, who has raised his hand. I request Abhishek to continue the questions, and then I'll step back in.
Okay, thanks, Annapurna. Thanks, Dr. Irani, for your scholarship. Well, I have multiple questions. I've written them out.
Thank you.
But perhaps, since we are talking of NID, your response now, kind of touches upon the last question, is that given that what you're saying, I was still a little, what shall I say, not disturbed, but the way you invoke the foundational, the mythical foundational object of the Eames Lota in the first page of your book, I would like you to kind of expand on it in the sense that, is that one part of you is kind of drawn to the Eames vision, and it's or how do you unpack that invocation? And one kind of addition is that, how do you respond, is that, which is kind of connecting to what you were saying, the Ford Foundation report, is that the Eames report, particularly the language in which it is kind of formulated within kind of elite Savarna, design pedagogy, design schools in India, the Eames report becomes an active tool in perpetuating kind of a silence around caste and craft. So how—
That's a really good point. Thank you. Yeah. So just to unpack what I meant with the invocation of the Lota, and thank you for engaging with my work and just bringing your own kind of knowledge and important insights to it. The thing that it wasn't so, to be totally honest, it wasn't so much the Lota itself that was interesting to me. It was the admission in the Eames report that design, that objects take their form because of long histories of many hands affecting their form as those objects move through different cultural and historical moments. And so but then where the Eames report still goes is that, yet still, even acknowledging the kind of broad-based production of material culture across many hands, yet still we must create an institute that then consolidates and creates a cadre of people who must guide this broader form of cultural production. So in some ways, actually, the invocation was meant to highlight, but it might not have come across, because the Lota and that quote is invoked on, prefatory pages, and then I don't deal with it for another 200 pages. It was actually meant to invoke a kind of depoliticization and making into technocratic the project of culture, because that's a theme that I pull throughout the book, the ways that design is used as and counterposed favorably to the mess of social movements, to the slowness of democracy, to those activists who are always pushing back. And so in that sense, I was thinking about caste as a problem, because I was influenced by political scientists in India who've written about the ways that the middle class illiberalisms, at the very moment that you have caste-based party movements that are making real claims on democracy and are putting their own politicians into office, there is a lot of Savarna talk about oh, how could this person have this project, build this monument, what a waste of money. I was present, I noticed those things. and so my uplifting of kind of messy democrat, my going back to, and in some ways maybe idealizing, like the messy democratic contentious process is my attempt to sort of support those kinds of developments and movements. But of course, like how I've actually accomplished that, whether I've done that effectively in a way that many audiences can pick up on, that is a question for the readers. So I really appreciate you bringing that out, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and what else needs to be said about it.
So there's a kind of connected or follow-up thing, if I may, Annapurna, with
yes,
your permission.
please. And then after that, I'll ask Anand's question that he
right. So, which is another question I had. I will kind of, leave the other question of remaking your personal self from technologist to critical theorist, that perhaps from some other time. But you also kind of invoke the provincializing figure, the provincializing innovation. Now, if say you were to kind of formulate it as, say, decolonizing innovation, then what would be the implications? And would you say that there is a certain kind of fundamental incommensurability between these two political visions, between provincialization, Dipesh Chakravarti's, and the post-colonial framework, and decolonization coming from a different political framework? And if you think that there is a certain incommensurability, then what would you say are the fault lines between the post-colonial and the decolonial worldviews or political imagination?
I think there's so many people probably in this room who would have something important to say about this, but I will, first thing, I'll preface this by saying, in some ways, I don't really consider myself a critical theorist. The posture I think I came to as I wrote the book was that, I'm somebody who's been I'm trying to unlearn certain habituses, and I'm trying to trace the contours of what alternative lines of flight, might be from a practice that many people have an investment in. So so in a way, like when I was writing the book, I was thinking about people like me in my 20s, or I was thinking about some of my friends at the design firm that did have a kind of, they had a critical perspective on what it is they were doing. And I was trying to make a work that would help them take, less responsibilize themselves for their failures to, turn the course on projects and see, how structural and historical the postures that they're pushed into are. And that actually continues into like how I work today, which is, I organize with Tech Workers Coalition in San Diego with, engineers and student data scientists. And so that's actually why I write. But in terms of this question of the decolonial and the post-colonial, I see the post-colonial as, primarily an intervention, frankly, primarily an intervention in how, how history gets told and perhaps how anthropology gets made. Dipesh Chakrabarti, like criticizing Marxist history 1 and calling for a history 2 that recognizes, different kinds of ontologies and ways of relating that are animating life, and how that, and like extensive subaltern studies work on the ways that those modes of practice and all those ontologies may have political consequences that cannot be known to an archive, but that have to be understood. And then I guess I see decolonial work as usually more linked to explicit political projects, although not always. I see decolonial work as, I think something that is currently the meanings of it are unfolding differently in different places. But, and so here I'm in San Diego on unceded Kumeyaay land, like as a, settler colonist in a settler colonial country. And so the ways that decolonization, like decolonial projects here, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang have argued, where I'm standing from, it cannot operate metaphorically. It has to operate with the knowledge that there's an actual colonial project that's ongoing, that operates through oil extraction, through surveillance, through criminalization of ways of life, and the imposition of other countries' sovereignties upon upon indigenous people here in the United States, and like the kind of refusal to a kind of a crushing of indigenous people's actual attempts to enact their sovereignties. And so I think if I were to talk about that in the context of India, like, of course, speaking as somebody who, is not, has not been there physically in several years, I think decolonization, brings, to me, it brings up questions of like, Adivasi claims over land, in forests that are being taken over by the government in the name of public forests, in the name of environmental development. It brings up questions of, Kashmir and like how, autonomy or freedom in Kashmir, is understood. You brought up the question of caste. Like, I would like to know if people in movements for, caste liberation find these decolonial conversations I'm more used to as being connected to sovereignty, useful as a political formulation. I haven't seen that. I think sometimes decolonial gets invoked as sometimes I think critical theory and academic worlds, invoke these terms, and then don't take them all the way to the kind of political implications of what they might mean. I see that a lot in the technology sphere. So, I've not seen the folks that I follow on caste liberation invoke the decolonial as much in the United States movements that I follow, but so I would love to hear what you think about that question.
I mean, there is a sense that at least definitely the post-colonial perspective is definitely less habitable to questions of caste.
Of course, I see what you're saying.
That's to put it, kind of put it mildly. So that was what I was trying to kind of, and I feel that since Mr. Chakravarti himself has moved into Chakravarti 2 with the climate, with his climate global universalizing mode, that this provincializing is a kind of coded attempt at kind of celebrating a certain kind of Savarna nativism.
I agree with that completely. It's not my place in some ways, but thank you for that point. I think, because I was coming at these projects as somebody who was, coming from technology, and then my PhD program was informatics, like I did my best to do my reading and to do my homework and to read, to read about these debates. But in some ways I don't really feel, there's my work as an academic, and then there's my work as a political person. And so I actually prioritize my work as a political person more. And so, for someone like me to get into a fight with Dipesh Chakrabarti, is probably kind of pointless and like not really helpful to anybody. But, I'll put my lot in, when some kind of organizing work needs to happen, or when I need to teach my students about caste. And so, but I had noticed that, this edited volume Habitations in Modernity, it had, I think, a Chakrabarti chapter. It had something to do with, toilets and sanitation. And I remember reading it and feeling like this is a very, Savarna perspective that seems uninterested in like what actual, what people, what if you ask people like what sanitation is for them, I imagine it might be, I am not forced to do this work for you, might be part of the story there as well, and what forms that they would like to pursue, the habitations they would like to live in. It seemed like not at all of interest in that chapter. And so these are things that like I teach my students about.
This is wonderful. But, this is wonderful.
If you need me to fight, I'll fight. Do you tell me? Like, I just, I try to do the work in solidarity rather than stepping into the void and saying, like, I had a thought about this, That makes sense.
Oh, wonderful questions, Abhishek. And there's a wonderful point that Anand has made. Anand, would you like to read it or would you like me to read it? Okay. I think that Anand is maybe not there, but I'll read it anyway because I think it makes such a beautiful point. Very cogent talk, Dr. Irani. Before we even get to change infrastructure to be more ethical, there's a huge indifference to spotting infrastructure itself. We use infrastructure without being conscious of it. After recognizing the infrastructure, we need to be able to, quote unquote, objectively rate it on ethical dimensions. Have you developed or plan to develop a framework to ethically rate infrastructure? All kinds of infrastructure.
So yeah, so there are some with labor, for example, with labor platforms, there's a project called Fair Work that does try to ethically rate infrastructures for how they treat workers. I think there's two kinds of impulses to rate. One impulse to rate comes from, I think, a liberal hope that if we have a framework for properly rating infrastructures and it's taken all the factors that people would want to consider into account, then we can come up with some common objective knowledge that can guide our decisions and can politically guide how decision makers and how we treat these infrastructures. I have a view of politics that is not. Politics does not happen because people in power have gotten better information about how the world works. Politics happens when people make claims that are held as legitimate to enough of a group of people who can create pressure that people in power have to listen or change, because if they want to remain in power, they're going to have to serve a different constituency with a different project. And so there's a kind of rating that the taxi worker project, actually, we were undertaking a project of making a scorecard. So as our county is considering different forms of transportation to connect people to major transit hubs, they have the choice of going with Uber or Lyft, or perhaps a private company that has a bus service. And so, or a cooperatively operated taxis that it's a cooperative, workers make the decisions together. It's run by African refugee workers who have been fighting more broadly for worker rights in San Diego for a long time. So we made what we thought would be a progressive scorecard of, here's what we think that groups in San Diego that are in solidarity with the taxi workers should be looking for in a transit solution. Does the money stay in the community or does it go to a Silicon Valley company? Does the company have a profit incentive to keep cars on the road, producing more carbon, or does it, is there an incentive in this plan to, get cars connecting people to transit? So in that sense, we were using this we made a tactical framework as a way of creating a formal and easier to read articulation of what a set of movement groups wanted to see in transportation, and to make it easier to, so that kind of framework, I'm involved in that in San Diego for transportation, but I think the way that the labor platforms work, like Fair Work is there, and it's not clear to me how workers, I think one of the things that happens is frameworks are often put together at a great distance from workers, and then they congeal a way of thinking about a complex system that then, ultimately is not accountable to workers. You have to make frameworks that are accountable to the people who are most directly affected, the workers, the users of these systems. And so I haven't seen a lot of, I think there's no way for me to create an objective ethical framework, because my commitment is to creating political and collective knowledge that's accountable to all the people that are directly affected by the thing we're making knowledge about. So sometimes that could be certain kinds of frameworks if they're done in certain communities, but in the labor scenario, that has not arisen as a thing that would be politically useful right now.
Lily, we're moving towards the end. Before we wrap up our conversation, let you get some rest and a cup of coffee. I wanted for you to reflect a little bit on what academia gives you in terms of crafting thought. I myself have had a very complex relationship with academia, going in and out, teaching sometimes in formal institutions. I love teaching and I have no complex relationship with that, but with academia, I have a much more complex relationship. So I'd love for you to say something.
I have two minds about this, and actually Akshay Rungta, who just posted in the chat, is going, what my knowledge of him is going to shape my answer. So I think, as a professor, or somebody who works in academia, in some ways, I kind of went through this journey of wrongheadedness, right? I was working in tech, and I thought academia was this place to do less alienated knowledge work, that you could work on research projects that are meaningful to you. But as I've come through the technology side of academia, I've seen the ways that, academia is also, beholden or subject to the kinds of funding that the academic institution pursues. The academia has had a long history of consolidating the knowledge-making power of certain people, landowners initially, like people from landowning classes, in some cases, people who are patronized by the landowning classes, in some cases in European history. And here in my personal experience in the United States, kind of Cold War history of creating like technocratic experts that serve the state. But I came to academia because of this aspiration to have a space to unlearn things and to connect with people, to connect with what people have written, what people have thought of, the artwork that people have made. And so that's still there. And so I see academia as offering both those things. So, Akshay, one of my friends who is here, we got to connect more closely. We met in Delhi as I was doing this project about design. We're both designers, but academia provided us a space where we could connect and take time with trying to diagnose some of the problems that we had seen that around randomized controlled trials. And he has done beautiful work trying to understand how designers can actually create organizations that allow people who are designing organizations to communicate in a way that like prioritizes the grassroots knowledge of people on the ground, and then helps them actually monitor and understand and control the form that organizations are taking, rather than just doing a randomized controlled trial, doing an intervention and sending some researchers who are outsourced by Yale, to study how it all went. So academia, I think, is a space of possibility, but it takes a lot of work to imagine how to like hold that space. Because if you just follow the grants, if you just follow the push in academia to produce people to be employable that we see, at least in the United States, then it's really easy to get pulled into becoming part of the ideological formation layer that, my friend Meredith Whitaker from AI Now calls it the critical academic industrial complex in tech, at least, that you like academics get a bunch of grants to produce a critical discourse, to produce critical convenings, but the function of these things is to have a place for companies and governments to point to see the debate is happening, but actually the people that are most directly affected by some of these big public problems are nowhere in the room. And in fact, the room is organized in a way where they couldn't have gotten there because of economic exclusion, because of caste exclusion, because of racialized exclusions. And the language and the problem has already been framed in a way that doesn't even speak to the thing that they're, it's almost being framed. Sometimes these academic, ethical, critical discussions are framed as alternatives, I think, to distract people from the very real political demands that are coming from other places. So I think it's about being aware of that and then taking it, but then using the infrastructure that academia makes available, like the libraries, the laboratories, the time sometimes when, to try to smuggle those resources so that other communities that are excluded can also maybe benefit from them.
So before I let you go, one anonymous attendee has raised a question a long time ago. I'm not sure if it's a question. I feel the infrastructure building inherently, especially in India, is an exclusionary process. Whether smart cities, Aadhaar, or Uber, Swiggy, Zomato, and that culture to subvert and negotiate these exclusionary frameworks is built and negotiated. Is the role of this kind of design thinking that you're speaking, advocacy, activism, academia in your case as well, or do you actually believe an inclusive infrastructure is a possibility?
I actually, in a way, I'm actually not advocating for design thinking at all. Like, I'm kind of advocating for, what most people talk about when they talk about design thinking. I'm not, if I had to say what I'm actually advocating for is, and I mean, I can't speak for the values of the people in the room, of course, but for me, it's, like organizing politically in a way that both resists the kinds of practices, infrastructures, policies that harm people on the basis of, in the United States, we talk a lot about racial capitalism as the way of hierarchicalizing people as part of the operations of how capitalist dispossession, exclusion, and exploitation work. And, if I were thinking kind of globally, like, to me, that it includes questions of, all kinds of, maybe this decolonization in the way Abhishek Hazra has talked about it is, capacious enough to talk about, like, dispossession of indigenous people around the world as well. What I'm advocating for is unlearning the things that we need to learn in the ways that we abet those systems of harm and exploitation, and then finding ways that we can be in solidarity and part of political movements to undo that. And I think if I were to kind of salvage like one thing from design, but that's not at all exclusive to design, is the desire and the kind of practice of imagining worlds and practices that we can build together. And designers in no ways have any kind of exclusive expertise in this. Abolitionists have done this. People who create community aid groups do this. And so designers can recognize that in movements. But I think there's a way where many of us like got involved because we hope to do those things, and there's a way to participate in that. I think, like, in my own context here, living here in the this border region, this Kumeyaay border region here, I think that these movements, like, we just need more hands on deck. Like, there's so much work to do, and also the more people are involved, the more like the kind of political demands might gain force. But also, of course, I have to say there's places where we have to. Some of us who are, if coming, like in my case, I'm Iranian American, so white passing count as white in the U.S. Census, definitely racialized. Like, there's times where like people who are also need to sit back and take the leadership and just provide resources to those who are most directly affected to be able to realize their visions, and like learning the skill of hearing and sitting back and gathering the resources and passing them along to someone else to act is part of what I'm advocating for too.
What a wonderful presentation. And I feel so enriched by our conversation. Thank you for coming, to you and to all the participants who've been here for the last 1.5 hours plus. And also to Akanksha and the team at KNMA for doing such a good job every time. The last talk in this series, I think, is on May 27th. And I will be posting that. And Lilly, please take care of yourself and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. I hope that I can, in some ways, if there's people in this room that, that have posed these powerful problems that I think really, are an important orientation, please stay in touch. And I've unlearned again through this process. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.